Opening. My phone buzzed for what felt like the 100th time today. Another WhatsApp notification from my sister Ashley. I glanced at my phone screen while organizing patient files at the pediatric ward's nurses' station, a familiar knot forming in my stomach. She'd been bombarding me with messages ever since her wedding last week. You'd think she'd be basking in newlywed bliss with Brandon right now, but instead, she's been frantically texting me about damage control. I swiped away another notification, trying to focus on my work. The morning shift at Boston Children's Hospital was always busy, but today, the weight of family drama made everything feel heavier. My colleagues noticed something was off. I'd been staring at the same medical chart for the past 5 minutes, my mind elsewhere. Emma, you okay? Sarah, one of the other nurses, touched my shoulder gently. You've been spacing out. Yeah, just family stuff. I managed a weak smile, my phone buzzing again. The situation with Ashley had started with what should have been a simple wedding invitation to our mom, Diana. But there was a catch that made everything spiral out of control. Mom wasn't allowed to bring a plus one. Looking back now, I should have seen this coming. The invitation itself arrived in an elegant cream envelope, professionally addressed to Mrs. Diana Mitchell, deliberately using Mom's maiden name instead of acknowledging her marriage to Michael. My sister's attempt to erase the reality of our family situation was already clear from that small detail. As I sit here at the nurses' station, surrounded by the familiar beeping of hospital monitors and the shuffle of medical staff, I can't help but think about how our family got to this point. It's not a story I enjoy telling, but maybe it's time to explain why a simple wedding invitation could cause such chaos in our lives. Family background. Our family's story isn't a simple one to tell. Growing up in a suburban house just outside Boston, I witnessed things no child should have to see. My parents' marriage was toxic from the start. I would know, being born just a year into it. As a little girl with pigtails and Band-Aid covered knees, I became an unwilling spectator to their volatile relationship. I can still picture our old house, with its faded blue shutters and creaking front porch. From the outside, we probably looked like any other middle-class family in the neighborhood. But inside those walls, a different story played out. My earliest memories are filled with the sound of raised voices, doors slamming, and the heavy footsteps of my father, Robert, stumbling home late at night. Ashley came along 4 years after me, a tiny bundle with curious eyes who had no idea what kind of world she was born into. By then, I was already well versed in the art of distraction. I knew exactly which toys made the most noise to drown out the arguments, which Disney movies were long enough to last through Dad's drunken tirades, and which corners of the house were safest when things got really bad. Emma, why is Daddy so angry? Ashley would ask, her small hands clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. I'd pull her close, trying to shield her from the reality of our situation. He's just having a bad day, I'd whisper, turning up the volume on The Little Mermaid for the third time that evening. Look, Ariel's about to sing again. At 8 years old, I was already playing the role of protector, a responsibility that would shape my entire life and eventually influence my career choice as a pediatric nurse. Working in pediatrics now, I've become particularly attuned to the signs of troubled homes in the children I treat. Sometimes, when I'm checking vitals or changing bandages, I catch glimpses of that same fear in my young patient's eyes that I used to see in Ashley's. It hits close to home, stirring up memories I've tried to push aside but never quite managed to forget. Painful memories. The hardest part about living with Dad wasn't just the violence. It was his ability to switch personas like flipping a light switch. I've seen this same pattern in families I work with at the hospital, and it still chills me how familiar it feels. One moment, Robert would be in a violent rage, and the next morning, he'd act like nothing had happened, casually sipping coffee at our kitchen counter and asking about homework. The kitchen of our old house became a stage for this bizarre performance. He'd stand there in his wrinkled work shirt, perfectly calm, hours after he'd been screaming and throwing things. If Mom tried to bring up his behavior from the night before, the yelling, the hitting, or the times he'd lock her in the bathroom until dawn, he'd stare at her with blank eyes. "I don't remember that," he'd say, spreading butter on his toast as if Mom wasn't standing there with barely concealed bruises. "You must be imagining things." Or he'd blame it on the alcohol. "I was drunk. It doesn't count." When Mom would gather the courage to mention divorce, he'd suddenly transform into yet another version of himself. The manipulator. His voice would soften, eyes filling with practiced tears as he'd make empty promises about change. "Diana, honey, I'll stop drinking." "I'll be better," he'd plead, reaching for her hand across our scratched kitchen table. "We're a family. We need to stay together." I'd watch from the doorway, my nursing textbook clutched to my chest, feeling my stomach turn at his performance. Even now, years later, I sometimes catch myself holding my breath when a patient's parent uses that same honeyed tone to make excuses. The worst part? He had no diagnosed mental illness, no condition that could explain or excuse his behavior. As a healthcare professional now, I've learned about various disorders that can affect behavior. But Robert was simply a narcissist who enjoyed controlling others. Sometimes that's the hardest truth for people to accept, that someone can choose to be cruel without any underlying condition to blame it on. The breaking point. Everything changed the weekend Mom had to attend her mother's funeral. I remember that day with crystal clarity. It's the kind of memory that stays sharp, even when you wish it would blur. I was reviewing my nursing school applications at the time, trying to stay focused on my future while our present was crumbling around us. Mom had to leave us behind because we had important exams at school the next day. Before leaving, she had practically begged Dad to stay sober for just 2 nights. I can still see her standing in our hallway, her black dress making her look even more fragile than usual. "Robert, please," she had pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my mother's funeral. Just 2 days. That's all I'm asking. The girls have tests tomorrow. They need to focus." Dad had merely grunted his agreement, barely looking up from his phone. He didn't even offer to accompany her to the funeral. Looking back now, with my experience working in healthcare and seeing how families support each other through grief, his behavior seems even more cruel. That first night, I was awakened by the sound of heavy footsteps stumbling up our stairs. The familiar scent of whiskey seeped under my bedroom door before Dad even opened it. I instinctively moved closer to Ashley, who was sleeping beside me, my body tensing as I prepared for what was coming. He burst into our room, the door banging against the wall. "Where's your mother?" he slurred, swaying in the doorway. The streetlight from outside cast strange shadows across his face, making him look like a stranger. The irony doesn't escape me now. In many ways, he was always a stranger to us. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely speak, but I forced myself to stay calm, just like I now teach young patients to do during difficult procedures. "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "Mom's at Grandma's funeral, remember? She told you before she left." That's when everything exploded. He started stumbling around our room, kicking at furniture and knocking things over. The sound of my childhood trophies crashing to the floor made Ashley stir beside me. Desperate to keep her from waking up to this nightmare, I made what turned out to be a crucial mistake. "Please," I whispered, "could you keep it down? You're scaring me." The violence erupts. Those words triggered something in him. His face contorted with rage as he screamed about respect and his authority in his own house. Through my years as a nurse, I've learned about trauma responses and fight or flight reactions, but nothing prepared me for that moment. He lunged forward, and the sharp crack of his hand against my face echoed through the room. I fell back, the taste of metal in my mouth, as Ashley jerked awake beside me. Her scream pierced the night as she grabbed onto my arm, her whole body shaking. My nursing instincts kicked in, even then. Check for injury, protect the vulnerable, find safety. The red handprint burning on my cheek became secondary to getting my sister out of there. Emma, Ashley's voice was thick with terror, her fingers digging into my arm as Dad continued his drunken rampage. In that moment, my training as a future healthcare provider merged with my role as a protective older sister. I knew we needed to get out. Fast. I grabbed Ashley's hand and ran. We bolted past Dad, who was still shouting incoherently, his words slurred and vicious. Down the stairs we went, my bare feet barely touching each step, Ashley stumbling behind me. The front door felt miles away, but we made it. The night air hit us like a wall of reality as we burst out of the house. Our neighbors, the Wilsons, lived just 2 doors down. They'd always given us concerned looks when they heard the shouting from our house, and now they were our only hope. "Run," I urged Ashley, pulling her along our suburban street. The asphalt was rough under our feet, but we didn't stop until we reached the Wilsons' front door. I started pounding on it, repeatedly pressing the doorbell, not caring about the late hour. My hand shook as I kept ringing, Ashley sobbing quietly behind me. Mrs. Wilson opened the door, her eyes widening as she took in our appearance. Me in my oversized Boston Children's Hospital volunteer t-shirt, Ashley in her Disney pajamas, both of us barefoot and trembling. She didn't ask questions, just ushered us inside and immediately called 911. "I need to call Mom," I managed to say between shaky breaths, the adrenaline still coursing through my system. Mrs. Wilson handed me her phone, and I dialed Mom's number, praying she would answer. The aftermath. When Mom heard my voice, she knew something was terribly wrong. "Emma? What happened?" Her voice cracked with worry through the phone. "You need to come home," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for Ashley's sake, even as tears streamed down my face. "Dad, he came home drunk. He hit me." We ran to the Wilsons. The bruise on my cheek throbbed as I spoke, a painful reminder that would later influence my career path in pediatric nursing and domestic violence awareness. Mom was on the next flight back. When she arrived at the Wilsons' house early the next morning, her eyes were red from crying. She pulled both of us into a tight hug, her body shaking with sobs. I can still remember the scent of her funeral dress, mixed with airport coffee. "I'm so sorry," she kept whispering, her hands gently touching the bruise on my face. "I'm so sorry." Now, as a nurse who often deals with family trauma, I understand the guilt she must have felt. But back then, I just wanted her to stop apologizing. Child Protective Services got involved after the police report was filed. Mom stepped forward immediately, her voice stronger than I'd ever heard it, as she assured them we would be staying with her. She filed for divorce the same week. Dad, in his typical manipulative fashion, didn't go quietly. He started calling constantly after he moved out, his number showing up on Mom's phone multiple times a day. Sometimes he would demand to talk to me, his voice alternating between anger and guilt-tripping. "You destroyed this family," he would say, his words slurring even in the middle of the day. "Your mother would never have left if you hadn't run away that night." Working now with families in crisis at the hospital, I recognize these tactics. The blame shifting, the manipulation, the refusal to accept responsibility. But back then, each call felt like a fresh wound. Despite his threats about always being in our lives, the courts granted Mom full custody and issued a restraining order. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing our testimony, didn't hesitate to protect us from further abuse. For the first time in years, We could breathe without looking over our shoulders. New beginnings. Life with just Mom wasn't perfect. We all had our struggles to work through. Mom fell into a depression while trying to juggle healing from her trauma and finding a job to support us. I'd come home from my hospital volunteer shifts to find her staring blankly at job applications on her laptop, her untouched coffee growing cold beside her. The child support payments from Dad helped keep us afloat, but the emotional toll was harder to manage. I threw myself into my nursing studies, finding purpose in learning how to help others, while quietly dealing with my own trauma through counseling. This experience would later shape my approach to treating children from troubled homes. Then Michael entered our lives. He worked with Mom at the restaurant where she'd finally found a job, and he was different from anyone she'd dated before. Being 6 years younger than Mom, he brought a fresh energy to our family dynamic. I'd catch Mom smiling at her phone when he texted, something I hadn't seen in years. He asked her out several times before she finally agreed. When she came home from their first date, there was a light in her eyes I barely recognized. She was almost shy when she told me about it, blushing like a teenager when I asked for details. "He's younger than me," she confided one evening while we sat on our small apartment balcony, the Boston skyline twinkling in the distance. People might talk. I remember taking her hand and squeezing it gently. "Mom, I see families at the hospital every day. Age doesn't matter. What matters is how he treats you." The smile she gave me then was worth everything we'd been through. But Ashley's reaction was completely different. She'd glare at her phone whenever Mom posted anything with Michael on social media, and she'd make excuses to leave the room when he came over. It wasn't that Michael had done anything wrong. Her resistance seemed to stem from the simple fact that he wasn't our dad. The denial. Ashley had constructed this fantasy in her head that our parents were somehow meant to be together, like characters in a romantic movie where everything works out in the end. I blamed Dad for planting these ideas. During her occasional visits with him, visits I chose to avoid, he would fill her head with promises of change and family reunification. She'd come home from these meetings with a dreamy look in her eyes, checking her Instagram feed constantly for any signs that Mom missed Dad. "He's really changed, Emma," she'd insist, showing me filtered photos of their coffee dates where he looked perfectly normal and put together. "He's been going to therapy and everything." My hands would often shake with frustration during these conversations, remembering the countless patients I'd treated whose parents made similar empty promises. But Ashley was convinced that Dad still loved Mom, and they were destined to reconcile. This delusional hope only made Mom's relationship with Michael harder for Ashley to accept. As their love grew stronger and Michael became a permanent fixture in our lives, I watched my sister retreat further into denial. She'd purposely exclude Michael from family photos she posted online, crop him out of group shots, or angle her camera so he wasn't visible. 4 years ago, when Mom and Michael decided to get married, they kept it simple, a courthouse ceremony with minimal fuss. I stood beside them as their witness, my heart full seeing Mom so genuinely happy. Michael had become the supportive partner she deserved, and as a family, we were healing. But Ashley refused to acknowledge the marriage publicly. She'd untag herself from any social media posts that mentioned Mom and Michael together. When her friends asked about our family, she'd skillfully dodge any mention of our stepfather. It was as if she was living in a parallel universe where the past 20 years hadn't happened, where Dad was still the misunderstood hero of her story. The wedding drama. When Ashley announced her engagement to Brandon earlier this year, I was genuinely happy for her. She seemed to have found someone stable and loving, everything our father wasn't. But then she dropped a bombshell during our weekly sister lunch at my favorite cafe near the hospital. "I'm inviting Dad to the wedding," she said casually, scrolling through wedding venues on her phone. My fork clattered against my plate, the sound sharp in the busy cafe. "What?" I managed to ask, memories of that violent night flooding back. As a nurse who regularly deals with trauma, I should have been better prepared for this conversation. But personal wounds run deeper. I kept my thoughts to myself, though. It was her wedding, her choice. But when the invitations went out, another problem emerged. Mom called me during my break at the hospital, her voice tight with hurt and confusion. "Emma, did you get a +1 on your invitation?" she asked. I could hear her trying to keep her voice steady. I had, in fact, received an invitation allowing a guest. So had most guests, according to the wedding planning updates Ashley kept posting on Instagram. But Mom's invitation was conspicuously restricted. No +1. No mention of Michael, despite them being married for 4 years. When confronted, Ashley revealed her true expectations. She wasn't just excluding Michael. She wanted Mom to pretend to be a happy family with Dad at the wedding, specifically for her new in-laws. The complete disconnect from reality in her request left me speechless. "They don't know about Michael," Ashley admitted during a tense FaceTime call. "I want them to see our real family, just Mom and Dad together." Her words felt like a slap, reminiscent of the physical ones we'd endured years ago. Confrontation. I tried to reason with Ashley, my nursing experience with family trauma making me particularly aware of how destructive her demands were. "Ashley, you can't just erase the past 20 years, I said during another tense phone call. "Mom is married to Michael. They're happy. And after everything Dad did." But Ashley exploded, her face red on my phone screen. "You never liked Dad. You're the one who turned Mom against him." Her words echoed through my apartment, making me grateful I was home alone after my hospital shift. The accusation hit hard. All those nights I'd spent protecting her, holding her while Dad raged downstairs, seemed forgotten. As someone who now works with traumatized children daily, I recognized her response as a coping mechanism, but it still hurt deeply. Mom, showing the strength that had helped her survive years of abuse, refused to play along with Ashley's fantasy. She wouldn't pretend to be a happy couple with Dad, wouldn't disrespect her marriage to Michael by hiding it. Her decision was final. She wouldn't attend the wedding under these conditions. The wedding itself was exactly as I'd feared. Dad showed up already drunk, reeking of whiskey and swaying slightly as he walked down the aisle. As a healthcare professional, I could spot the signs of intoxication from across the room. I kept my distance, avoiding even eye contact, the memory of his violence still fresh after all these years. His speech was a slurred mess, embarrassing everyone present. While other guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, I found myself automatically assessing the situation as I would at work, watching for signs of escalating behavior, planning exit routes if needed. It was supposed to be a celebration, but old trauma responses die hard. The current situation. Now, a week after the wedding, my phone keeps lighting up with WhatsApp messages from Ashley. Between checking patients' vitals and updating medical charts, I see her increasingly desperate texts. Her in-laws, who've met Mom several times at family gatherings, are asking questions about her absence at the wedding. Instead of telling the truth, Ashley has started spinning a narrative that paints Mom as the villain. She's telling Brandon's family that Mom simply didn't care enough to attend, that she ignored multiple requests to be there. My stomach churns every time I read these messages. As a nurse, I'm trained to document everything accurately, and these deliberate distortions of truth go against everything I believe in. Now, Ashley wants me to be part of her cover-up. She's planning a post-honeymoon lunch with her in-laws and wants me there to corroborate her story. My phone buzzes again with another message. "Please, Emma. Just help me explain why Mom didn't come. They don't need to know everything." Sitting here at the nurse's station, watching families come and go, some happy, some struggling, all doing their best, I find myself at a crossroads. As a nurse, I've learned that healing can't begin until you acknowledge the truth of what happened. But Ashley's my sister, and despite everything, I want to support her as she starts this new chapter of her life. Part of me wonders if this is karma for all those times I tried to distract her from the truth when we were kids. Maybe if I hadn't protected her so much from reality then, she wouldn't be living in denial now. But that's the kind of thinking my therapist would want me to challenge. We did what we had to do to survive. So here I am, stuck between supporting my sister and maintaining the lies she's built around our family history. The truth about Mom's absence isn't mine to hide, but it isn't really mine to tell either. What would you do in my situation? Update 1. The truth about Mom and Michael. During my break at the pediatric ward, I feel I should explain more about Ashley's complicated feelings toward Mom and Michael's relationship. Ashley has always been weird about their age gap, Michael being 6 years younger than Mom. It's hardly scandalous, especially here in Boston, where I see all kinds of modern families at the hospital, but Ashley acts like it's some huge scandal. The truth is, Ashley has never properly acknowledged Mom and Michael's marriage to her in-laws. Yes, Brandon knows, but his family remains in the dark. Mom and Michael had a simple courthouse wedding, no fancy ceremony or Instagram-worthy celebration. They've never been the type to plaster their relationship all over social media, which has made it easier for Ashley to pretend Michael isn't really part of our family. Ashley's gone as far as begging Mom not to mention her marriage to any of her friends or Brandon's family. "It's so embarrassing," she'd text, usually followed by multiple crying emojis. Mom, showing the same patience she developed during years of handling Dad's abuse, would usually comply with these requests. She kept Michael in the background during Ashley's events, probably hoping that Ashley would eventually grow up and accept reality. But the wedding invitation, that was the final straw. After years of compromising, of hiding her happiness to make Ashley comfortable, Mom finally stood her ground. As someone who works with families in crisis, I recognized this as a crucial moment of boundary setting. You can only bend so far before you break. Update 2. The confrontation. I shared all these responses and concerns with Mom during our weekly Sunday brunch, and she finally agreed it was time for a serious talk with Ashley. The confrontation happened last week in our family room, the same space where we've had so many difficult conversations over the years. Mom did something she'd never done before. She brought out the hospital records and divorce papers, spreading them across the coffee table like the medical charts I handle every day at work. She finally told Ashley every detail about Dad's abuse, no longer protecting her from the harsh reality we'd lived through. I watched Ashley's face as she looked at the documents, her Instagram perfect composure crumbling as she faced the undeniable evidence. Working in pediatric care, I've seen this moment of realization before, when someone's carefully constructed narrative falls apart in the face of hard evidence. Still, Ashley tried to cling to her illusions. "Maybe he's different now," she argued weakly, her voice trembling. "People can change, right? Maybe if you just tried being friends with him." Mom and I exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication I've perfected with my nursing colleagues during difficult situations. We had to be firm. I told Ashley that if she continued to glorify Dad while knowing everything he'd put us through, we might need to take a step back from our relationship. It wasn't an ultimatum. I've learned from my work with troubled families that those rarely help. It was about setting boundaries. Ashley looked shocked. She wasn't used to us being so direct about this. She asked for time to process everything. And as a healthcare professional, I understand the importance of giving people space to deal with difficult truths. Final update. 4 months have passed since that confrontation. Just like I've seen countless times with families at the hospital, healing takes time and often comes in unexpected ways. Ashley finally did something I never thought she would. She told her in-laws the truth about why Mom missed her wedding. I was on my night shift at the pediatric ward when she called to tell me. Her voice was shaky but determined as she explained how she'd sat down with Brandon's family and revealed everything. After learning about our family's history of abuse and trauma, they were surprisingly understanding about Mom's absence. Ashley then took the biggest step. She apologized to Mom. It happened during a quiet dinner at Mom's house, where Michael had cooked his signature lasagna. Mom, true to her nature, embraced Ashley with open arms, showing the same kind of forgiveness I've witnessed in countless family reconciliations at the hospital. Mom even took the initiative to meet with Brandon's family herself, helping to clear up any lingering misunderstandings. These days, Ashley has minimal contact with Dad, a decision she made on her own. As a nurse who's seen many families work through trauma, I know how significant these small steps toward healing can be. The tension that had been building in our family for years has finally started to dissipate. I see it in the way Ashley now likes Mom and Michael's photos on Instagram, in how she stopped trying to hide their relationship from her friends. Sometimes the smallest signs of acceptance mean the most.